Hello and welcome to this ISM Trust webinar, Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment, Applying the Revised Curriculum Frameworks. I'm Ella Doyle, Events Coordinator and Communications Officer at the ISM, and to describe myself for the purpose of accessibility, I'm a white woman with brown hair and the ISM Trust logo is behind me. The ISM Trust is the ISM's sister charity which offers high-quality professional development to everyone working in music. Through the Trust, the ISM gives back to the sector and supports and empowers music professionals to succeed. We produce award-winning events, training and resources which are largely completely free to access. Please consider supporting the work of the ISM Trust by becoming a friend, making a donation or leaving a legacy. Any support you can offer is really appreciated. I am delighted today to be joined by Dr. Alison Daubney and Professor Martin Fautley, who will present the new and revised frameworks for curriculum, pedagogy and assessment in secondary music education. Before we begin the webinar, just a few things to note. Please do introduce yourselves to your fellow attendees in the chat box. Let us know your role in music and where you're joining us from. And during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer these at the end. If you experience any technical difficulties, let us know and we'll attempt to resolve these as well. And if you wish to use them, subtitles are available to enable at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and we will send the recording out to you afterwards. Now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Ali and Martin. Thank you, and over to you.
Hello, so I'm Martin Fautley. I am Emeritus Professor of Music Education at Birmingham City University. And for the purposes of accessibility, I'm a white male with grey hair, wearing a blue shirt with black glasses on. And I'm sitting in a room.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ali Daubney, and I'm an Honorary Senior Lecturer in Education at the University of Sussex. And for the purposes of accessibility, I'm a white woman with fair hair. I've got a blue top on and I've got a kind of a bookshelf just behind me. We'll move into what we're going to talk about today. So Courtney is very kindly going to share some slides for us. As Ella's already mentioned, we're going to be talking about applying the revised curriculum. It says primary music education on the slides, and we've either got the wrong title or the wrong slide.
No, it should say secondary. That's the one. This is the right presentation.
That's perfect, because I knew that the next slide was right. So we wrote some curriculum resources quite a few years ago now, which we've revised and updated over time. They've recently had quite a big refresh, and it's these resources which we're going to be talking about today. If you can move on to the next slide, you'll see on the screen that there's a QR code and a link. All of the resources which we've produced for primary and also lower secondary, which is what we're talking about today. So approximately in English terms up the age 11 to 14, slightly different depending on where you're joining us from. But the QR code is there for you to pick up the free resources and download them for yourselves. In terms of what we
don't know why there's a dinosaur in the middle. Can I just?
No, I like it though. I didn't expect that before, but yeah, it's a cool dinosaur and it still works even with the dinosaur, so that's great. On the next slide, it tells us just a little bit about what we're covering today. In kind of speed dial, really, we're going to be thinking about assessment in context, which really means putting assessment in the context of where it fits with what we do and how we do it, curriculum, pedagogy and assessment together. So what does that mean in musical learning? And to lay our cards on the table, we're really talking here, and we talk about this right at the beginning of our booklet, about teaching music musically with sound as a central part of that. And so creating and making music being very central to helping support how we think about music and kind of learn in music as well as through music. So really the assessment of the musical ideas becomes part of that bigger process, not something that we try to aggregate separately. And so it's about therefore evidencing, planning and promoting this over time. There's another booklet which we've put together, which is on the next slide, which is slightly in need of an update at the moment, but we put it in here today just to show you that we haven't kind of picked these ideas up from nowhere. And there's a really, loads of research underpinning the ideas which we're talking about. And this orange booklet, as we call it, the orange booklet kind of brings together a lot of this research. So if you're interested in delving deeper into that, then you'll find all of that in here. And
which, as Ali said, is due for an update in line with the with our more recent thinking. But I just wanted to pick up and say, I'm not sure that it might not be out of print, but any second now, there will be an updated version.
Yeah, it's definitely it's in process. That's not to say that a lot of what's in there doesn't, you know, there's new stuff that's come out that we'll be adding in and thinking about. Thinking about the curriculum itself, we're thinking about a big word here as curriculum, not just the official curriculum, the national curriculum, if you like. What is it? Just one page of A4, kind of light in weight, but perhaps heavy in things that we have to think about. We're also thinking about curriculum being everything that's learned during school activities, which isn't part of the hidden curriculum. And that isn't part of the official curriculum, rather. That, along with the observed curriculum, what we can see leads us to the thing that we're most interested in. When we talk about music in schools and assessment, we're thinking about whole children, not atomised ideas. So curriculum as experience, the parts of the curriculum, both official and hidden, which actually connect meaningfully with children. What is it that connects meaningfully with them and makes them think that music is a subject in which they're interested and which they can thrive?
So what we've done in the booklet is to be thinking about what is going on in curriculum terms. And one of the important things about the lower secondary school curriculum is that in most cases, this is not externally imposed. Most teachers have responsibility for their Key Stage 3, or whatever it's called in your context, curriculum, and they are able to decide, you or we are able to decide what goes into it. So it's quite important to think about curriculum and assessment as being interlinked. Courtney, there's 3 sub-bullets on it. If you put them all up at the same time, that's it, that's great. So the first of the big questions is aimed at you as curriculum architect. And the question is, what do you value in music education? And this is a really important question that is worth spending a few minutes of reflective time as you sit there with your cocktail by your private swimming pool, thinking about what it is that you can consider this evening. So have a think about what do you value in music education? And that's quite a big and deep question. And it's worth really giving it some thought and some consideration. And then added to that is, what do your pupils value? So not just what do you value, but what do they value? And how do these mesh together? And then finally on this link, what does your school community value? And that can be sort of anything from what does SLT value to what to the community around the school and the wider community. What's going on there? What are the values that are taking place that you have in your curriculum? So the first of the big questions that we ask is this one, and we really hope that people spend a little bit of time thinking about it, which takes us, Courtney, onto that one, thank you very much, which is then a somewhat related question, but again, is about your curriculum. Having thought about what it is that you value, the next question becomes, where is it? Yeah, that's the one. So how does what you value appear in your lower secondary school curriculum? So having thought about what it is that you value, where is that thing or those things? Where is what you value in your lower secondary school curriculum? Now, in the booklet, there's a series of these questions. And in this webinar, we haven't really got time to go through all of them. So the next slide appears to jump. This is going to big question 4, which is about how do the pedagogies you employ at lower secondary school music support your values? So what is it that you're teaching? Why are you teaching it then? And what ways are you teaching it? What sorts of pedagogies do you have? And again, assuming, and I realise that assumptions are always dangerous, if we are all in control of our own Key Stage 3 destinies, what pedagogies have we chosen to use? Do we always use the same pedagogies that everything or do different things entail teaching, being taught in a different way. So where do these fit with your values? Then the next slide takes us to big question 5, which is about assessment. So do you assess what you value? Back in big question 1, we asked you to think about what it is that you value. So having thought about what it is that you value, this then moves to the assessment point. Do you assess what you value? Having delineated what your values are, how do those figure in assessment? And if you do assess what you value, how do you assess it? And why? Why are you assessing it? So there's all sorts of questions related to this. Why are you assessing it in the first place? What is going on? So there's some really difficult questions to be asked. The next slide takes these apart slightly. So revisiting whatever it was you said in answer to the questions earlier, where are your values evidenced in your assessments? How are they evidenced? How is it apparent that whatever it is you value is something that you assess? In assessment, there's a thing called construct under representation, which is a sort of technical way of saying things aren't there. So are there things that you value that you aren't assessing? Maybe the answer to that is they're far too difficult to assess, so I'm not going to assess them. What is missing in terms of what's going on? So is construct under representation there? Are there things that you value that you don't assess? And there can be, and there can be a perfectly good reason for it. But then this takes us to thinking about, if there are things that you aren't or don't assess, what are the reasons for this? And why does it happen? And what's going on? And Ali's going to pick some of these up in the next slide.
So one of the things about the big questions, there are 12 big questions in total, and there are lots of sub-questions underneath those, and they're split into different parts. And as Martin said, we haven't really got time to do anything other than scratch the surface of some of those today. But the second section of that is around the purposes of the lower secondary school music and thinking about what is the purpose of music in my school. And if you thought of that for your own community, that's the best way to kind of do that. Nationally, we're at a situation where around 95% of children probably don't carry on in a kind of examination sense into music. And so you need to think about what you put in and why you put it there. And this next slide is really talking about the key processes, the musicking things, I suppose you might call them, which are interrelated and overlapping. That are the things that we do in music: the singing, composing, which has got obviously improvising in, playing, which has potentially also got improvising in, listening. All of these things overlap, you know, they're not separate things. But through Key Stage 3 music, it's a very practical lens through which you do things, and you choose, as Martin described it, as the curator of your curriculum, what's in and what's out. You know, why is it that in year 7 you might choose to do that unit followed by that unit followed by that? And what does that bring in? The singing, the composing, the playing, those things. On the right hand side of that, you can see it says, in addition, there are 3 overarching themes, which Martin and I talked about quite a lot, which run through the processes. The idea of creativity, creative practices, critical engagement with something. So critical engagement comes in all sorts of different ways, realizing you're not quite in tune, being able to give yourself some critique or give other people critique, take the critique, that kind of thing. Think about what you might want with your own music. So that is a massive term which kind of permeates all of these. And then we've got these broader aspects of learning which come in. And if you move on to the next page, we've put these things, you know, the singing, improvising, listening, playing, composing, into the idea of a spiral, which probably won't be new to many of you, and there's a lot of spirals around. They give the idea, as you can see, of increasing challenge, and obviously when you come to replan something that includes improvising, it's about building on what you had. When you change the context of the music or the genre or the instruments or something about it, it may be that young people don't necessarily just keep moving in an upward direction. That isn't really how learning and life works, but there's movement up and down in a generally upward direction. But you can see these three things: the broader aspects, the critical engagement, and the creativity going through. So the broader aspects of learning are things like the habits, the values, behaviours and attitudes that young people have. So if they can't, you know, they don't want to keep repeating something, or they find it very difficult to be constructive, then, you know, those broader aspects are all things which actually also impact musicianship and growing musicianship. And I'm going to pass back to Martin.
One of the things that music education requires us to think about is, what is it that is going on? And one of the ways that we can do this is by thinking about what is happening when children and young people learn to do something in music. And so what we have at the top of this picture are two boxes, understanding and doing, with sort of spiraling round arrows. So it's not quite like the previous spiral, because these we keep going round and round. And this we learn to do something musically by doing it. And when we've understood it, then we're able to say that we can understand it because we can show that we can understand it by doing it. So an example that I can give for this is, I am utterly unable to get a sound out of an oboe. So if you give me an oboe, it just sounds like I'm doing horrible things to a duck. It is truly dreadful. So I cannot play anything whatsoever on the oboe. But as a reasonably literate academic professor, I can probably write you a perfectly good essay on the development of the oboe since the Renaissance era, with footnotes and references, that would explain to you what is going on and what has been going on with oboe playing. But you wouldn't book me for your next gig playing the oboe on the basis of the fact that I can write an essay about it. And exactly the same thing would go on if you substitute oboe for lead guitar. So again, I can write you a reasonable essay on the development of what's going on in electric guitar, but you're not going to book me for a gig on the basis of what I've written. And assessment needs to think about this. Are we assessing in the domain in which the understanding and the achievement is evidenced? What are we doing when we do this? And it's to do with going round in that learning by doing and showing that we can do something, because understanding is evidenced in achievement. At the bottom of this going round and round in boxes are those three triangles. And these are to do with all sorts of assessment, because what we then need to do with the young people that we're teaching is we need to identify both what it is that they can do and what it is that they need help with. And assessment, particularly summative assessment, that's required of us by systemic purposes of assessment, often require a quantity to be placed on that. And that can be a grade, a mark, a level, a number, whatever. So not only do we have to identify, but in many cases, we also have to quantify. And that requires thinking about what it is that we're doing and how are we quantifying something. Often as music teachers, our primary function is to be able to help people. So we really want to be doing that. That's what we're doing. So to this end, what we then are able to do is produce a series of questions, which are on the next slide, please. So what do you want pupils to learn and be able to do at various stages in the curriculum? Have you defined these? And then importantly, related to that previous image, are these related to activities or learning? So is there a learning and doing split? Do you say, I want them to be able to do this, this, and this, and in the process of that, they will learn this, this, and this? Do you say, I want them to learn this, this, and this, and they learn by doing the following? And so it's thinking about, what is it? Is it activity or learning? What's going on in your curriculum? And then importantly, what about quality? How is quality expressed in these? How do we say how good something is? What's the quality of something that the children and young people have done? And because it's music, how is that evidenced when we listen to it. So if we listen to a recording of it, how can we say that this recording, whatever it is demonstrating quality? And for music teachers, this can be quite a big issue, because we've got to account for pupils with different prior musical experiences, motivation, learning requirements, everything. I've always said that all music classes are, in old money terms, are mixed ability classes, but everything in a music class is a mixed bag of what's going on. So these are all things that, again, are showing how curriculum and assessment are built. And over to Ali now, who's going to talk a bit about how this is done in the framework. Oh, sorry. I'll carry on for a bit, Ali. You appear to be on mute.
Oh, it's all right. I'm back, but you carry on if you like.
Oh, okay. No, I was just going to say, so what we have here, what Ali and I did is to produce, hold on, while I think both Ali and I are reaching for our books, is we have produced in the paper copy and downloadable is this chart, which I appreciate. If you're looking at on your laptop, you won't be able to see at all. So the next two slides enlarge it, basically. So on the next slide, this asks, how does what you value appear in your lower school curriculum? And what it says across the top are a series of questions, being musical through, and then down the left-hand side are all the things that Ali talked about in the spiral. Then it goes through the skills, the pedagogies, the knowledge and understanding, and approaches to developing knowledge and understanding. And importantly, down at the bottom, in the non-coloured boxes, are the sorts of questions that are being asked. So what, why, how, why, what. All that is going on there. Ella's kindly put a link where you can download the booklet. So the thing that I've just shown you is in the booklet itself. And that's much better than looking at my face, but that's the thing. And you'll find it much easier to read there, and you'll be able to see this. This is the view of what this does in slightly more detail for those of you who might be looking at it on your phone or on your iPad or something. You can now see how those various things that you value we're asking you to think about them, and we're asking you to think about what it is in your curriculum with your pupils that are going on that means you're actually able to think about assessment of your curriculum and what the learning is and the doing that's arisen from this. Okay, and I think at this point I really will hand over to Ali.
That's all right. Thanks, Martin. I think the important things to remember here are about the idea of having so many different kinds of musical experiences, as Martin was saying, in your classroom. But what does that mean for your planning? And obviously, with the framework that we've put together, our hope is that really it gives you an opportunity to look at your own curriculum and think about on a kind of yearly basis or across the whole key stage basis, what is it that I'm looking for? And that's not to say I'm going to take A-level music and just pare it back and pare it back and pare it back. So it's not about, because obviously that shuts down a lot of avenues for some children as well who may go off in different directions. But thinking about what is desirable in Key Stage 3, first of all, when they come in from Key Stage 2, to think about how you consolidate and build on the skills they've got, and then how you grow them from there. So you've got a whole key stage, you've got years, you've got terms, you've even got within a lesson. So if you would think about, okay, within this lesson, what is the musical learning? It's a singing focus. What is it? What's the actual skill that I'm trying to develop? Not to get them just to sing the song through from beginning to end. So what we're trying to get you to do is to think of an inspiring curriculum, really, and just look at what you've got and perhaps tweak it. So that it doesn't put a glass ceiling, so that when you get to the assessment part of it, you've actually put in a curriculum that's free and open enough for all children to be able to thrive and for you to be able to support them. So it doesn't put a glass ceiling on where they can get to. So if you move on to the next slide for me, please. The framework itself has got these two parts. The part A is the bit we've kind of just looked at, really, which has got these ways to help you do things. And then part B, which is the other side of the page, which has got things like, you know, you look at your materials But then we're going to move on to look at the assessment criteria and the things around assessment. If you go on to the next slide for me, please. The big questions here come to, if you've only got music for an hour every other week on a 2-week rotating timetable, that's 15 hours approximately per year by the time you've taken out the school dentist and a couple of trips. Do they have still school dentists in your school? Maybe. But if you get 2 hours a week, you get 60 hours a year, of music. And so obviously the outcomes and the curriculum that you plan are going to look very different. You're thinking really about the coherence of your curriculum, and part of that coherence is helping to show the children in your classes how something that they've done before when you've been doing African drumming does actually still relate to something you're doing at the moment that's around body percussion or around something to do with creating chords on ukuleles and rhythm, or those kinds of things. So it might look coherent to us, but sometimes we also have to make that explicit to young people too. We're going to talk a lot in a minute about the idea of progression. So does your curriculum in and of itself evidence progression? What's that going to mean? We'll look at that in a second when we get to ideas on assessment. And are you looking at it across a big period of time, or are you just surviving on a kind of lesson by lesson atomistically, or looking at it over a period of time holistically approach? The right-hand side of the document, which we split down in different ways, will look at the ways in which you might look at how you see the assessments, because you need to think about criteria based on what you put in without closing things down. And I'm going to pass on to Martin while we start talking about very briefly this idea of assessment itself.
So there's a great quote from the marvellous music educator Keith Swanwick, who said, "To teach is to assess." And this is so true of music education, that this is what we're doing all the time. And we will talk a lot more about formative assessment. We're also going to talk about summative assessment. And in many cases, these are the things that really we need to get to the nitty-gritty of in terms of what's going on. So on the next slide, please, Courtney, just do all the three things at one go. That's it. So what we have is we've taken the view, and this is Ali and I have taken this view, but as she said earlier, it does come from research, that assessment begins with curriculum planning. And something that a number of people have said, there's an Ofsted thing somewhere, which is about curriculum planning should begin with learning, not content. So it's thinking about what do you want the pupils to learn, and this goes back to that slide I was saying, rather than what you want them to do. And then assessment arrives or derives, depending on how you look at it linguistically, from this. So your curriculum planning then leads into your assessment. And that's quite an important notion. So on the next slide, there is a nice quote. "This is what we don't want. For many children, assessment means enduring a form of mental and emotional derangement, the morbid exchange of a warm living experience for a cold, dead reckoning." Ross et al. I appreciate that comes from last century, but that's really important notion for us. We want, Keith Swanwick wrote about teaching music musically. We also want to think about assessing music musically, and we don't just want this cold, dead reckoning. So let's unpick some of the things that we've done in the materials. So on this slide, and there's a series of things like this, and again, this is all comes from the book, which I won't wave around at you again, but it's all in there. We've produced a series of assessment criterion statements, what our American chums tend to call rubrics. Let's go with assessment criterion statements. So these are not intended to be either sequential or developmental. They're simply illustrative, and the booklet makes it quite clear. So for the purposes of this presentation, that's not so obvious, so I'm saying it here and now. They are illustrative, not cumulative, and not developmental. And what we've tried to do is produce assessment criterion statements that relate in assessment terms to a singularity. We both have seen assessment criteria statements that have the word and in a lot. So the children can do this and this and this and this. And this makes it quite problematic when you start coming to apply these, because what happens if they can do this and this, but not the and? So what we want to do is to try and make assessment criterion statements as simple as possible. So as far as we can, the word and doesn't appear to relate to a sequence of constructs. So what we've tried to do is create these assessment statements that can be assessed, and we come to grading criteria in a minute, but that the same assessment statement can be graded. And we'll talk about the grading, but that you don't have separate assessment statements for each level of outcome. Now, that's quite important. We know that in many cases, there's 1.4, I think, music teachers in the average secondary school. So if there are 1.4 of you, that means most of you teach absolutely everyone in Key Stage 3. That's got to be a manageable process. The assessment has to be managed so that you can do it. So the point of these statements is that you can pick out them, and it's not pick out all of them, it's choose, it's a pick and mix approach, and you choose which are appropriate. So this slide shows singing and improvising. The next slide, please, Courtney, shows composing and listening. And you'll see there are different numbers of criterion statements, and this is deliberate because we didn't just want people to try and use them to follow through. What we're thinking, as I said, is that they can be done. So if we take a random one off of composing, so composing a functional piece of music which meets demands of the brief, and that can be then thought of as an assessment criterion statement. At its simplest, let's say they can't do it, they can do it, they can do it very well. We're going to add a fourth one to that in a moment, but at its simplest, can't, can do well. That grading criteria can be applied to all of these. The next one, please, Courtney, has performing, and then we've also got some for broader aspects on. The same sort of grading criteria is applied. And that's really quite important, because what we've really tried to do is create these as example assessment criterion statements. As you can see, there's a number of them. And can I just say that this is quite hard to do. Ali and I spent many hours with ice packs strapped to our heads trying to produce these. It's not as simple, oh, I'll just do it over a cup of tea in 5 minutes. It's quite hard to do, but you do need to think about what's appropriate for you, what's appropriate for you in your school, with your pupils, your curriculum and your community. So all of these sample statements are available in the booklet. And on the next slide, this is the grading criteria that we are suggesting. Now, we've gone with what we've seen in a lot of schools, and we've seen an awful lot of schools where the assessment policy of the school is that a 4-point scale is used. And the 4-point scale is variations on emerging, establishing, embedding, and enhancing. That's a 4-point scale. I talked about the 3-point scale, which is can't, can, and well. Your school may well have a different system in place. Hopefully, the statements that we've produced will work with a lot of grading criterion policies that schools have. As I've said, those assessment criterion statements are meant to be examples. They're meant to be graded in a variety of ways. At its simplest is this idea of the 4-point scale. But if your school is different, that's fine. But what is important to say is that we think summative assessment is periodic assessment. This isn't something that we think is feasible to undertake absolutely every lesson. This is something which is done every now and then. This is occasional assessment, and this is the way in which we're suggesting it can be worked. I think my voice needs a quick squeak now, so over to Ali, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Martin. Just staying on that just for a moment, we also think it's really important around the summative assessment that It isn't too frequent, but that also we think very, very carefully about how we share it with pupils, whether we share it with pupils, and what that kind of looks like and what the expectations around that are. Because I think we could all come up with many young people who are very musical beings, who have come to think themselves as unmusical because somebody goes and slaps a number on them, just as they do in geography and in art and in maths and English, which they're more used to, of course. But as soon as you start going down that route, it it can say to somebody, depending on how they take it, this is how I feel about myself as a developing young musician. And so the least you can give numbers out, the better. I mean, it is report writing time, although obviously in secondary schools we do write reports at different times in the year, and that's really when the summative assessment comes to the fore. But if we move on to the next slide, please. What we've got here is an assessment grid. Now, of course, in any unit, if we're going for depth of work, rather than kind of scattergun approach, we might only have a few of these things. So what we've done here is we've taken some of those statements and we've put them down the side. There are a lot of them. You couldn't possibly really have one unit that covers all of those things. But if you go on to the next slide for us, it's about taking, so for example, in a unit, composing a piece of music which has a clear sense of style, structure and purpose. If that's your thing, that it's an idiomatic response to a given or chosen stimulus. So whatever you're doing, I mean, I'm sure in your heads you could think of a million ways in which you could try and get to that learning through different means, through different instruments, through different genres, through using technologies, performing fluently, creating a convincing performance, and then is able to, at the bottom, recognise different technical aspects of music, such as time, texture and instrumentation. So it's just picked a few of those things. So within any unit, this is still a lot. You may even have less, and be focusing on getting them to really do something in quite a lot of detail and quite well. And obviously the idea of this is that if you had to have some kind of way of assessing, it might be that this is your aspiration across the year, rather than in every unit. That summatively you might say across the year, emerging, establishing, embedding and enhancing has gone well beyond, if you like. Composes a piece of music which has a clear sense of style, structure and purpose. I mean, that's quite a big aspiration and a good aspiration for young people. They often, though, work in groups, which is an amazing thing in music in Key Stage 3 and something that you often see. So you think about whether it's okay to do this with a group, and whether you get individuals and young people themselves involved in the assessment, and looking for themselves to decide where they are. For me, though, the important bit is what comes next. And so, if you like, that's the summative part of it. But if you were on the previous slide, and it said compose a piece of music, and you said, all right, I'm establishing whatever that's going to mean. It's getting there. The important part is so what happens next and how am I going to do that, which leads us into the next part, which is where we're going to talk just very briefly about the most important part of assessment and teaching and learning in general. I think this idea to teach is to assess really comes from the idea of the formative developmental, as we've put here, feed forward assessment. It's the often in the moment, the instant stuff. It's the teacher having a radar on their head and knowing where to be in the classroom, and when the class is singing, to go and stand in a particular place and put a group back in time without stopping the musical processes, all of that kind of stuff. And there are so many ways in which the formative developmental is actually the thing that drives the musical learning. Quite a lot of places now you go in and go, oh, what are you doing? Say, we're doing formatives. What does that mean? Oh, it's a mini test. It's not a mini test unless it's got the purpose of being able to drive the musical learning forward. You don't need to do tests necessarily for that. That can come through the discussion, through the careful questioning, through the many ways in which you support musical learning kind of in the moment. And so for us, this is the most important. It's not the testing, test scores and final judgment. It's actually, all right, I've done that. It's not, I've got my grade 3. What do I do next? I do my grade 4. And there's also something that Janet Mills talked about, which is being able to do something better, to play the same piece of music or use the same piece of music in year 9 that you had in year 7, but you're more able to perform it or to do something with it, which is what we might call better quality, if you want to call it that, you know, more musically, more fluently, more idiomatic, whatever it may be. So we don't have to keep giving new stuff all the time. There's actually real value in going back to things. So it doesn't involve numbers and grades. It doesn't involve marking. It certainly doesn't involve all the different colour pens. But it's actually, as Martin has talked about many times, the verbal feedback stamp, sticking it on your forehead. What do you need that for? You know, actually, it's the comments, the recording of the comments, perhaps on audio, if that's appropriate to what they're doing, but finding ways for young people to know where they are in their learning, what it is they want to or need to do next, and importantly, how they're going to get there through the conversation, through the listening, through your scaffolding in different ways, writing down suddenly chords for them, or whatever it is that it needs to be. So putting the scaffolding in the way. So the key part of it, it's developmental. We can move on to the next slide. We're coming towards the end now. But Harlan and James, and there are so many quotes we could have picked actually about formative assessment, knowing about pupils' existing ideas and skills, not just from their music classroom, but from their musical lives. So everybody who comes into your classroom has got this rich musical, you know, back catalogue, if you like, that's going to be different to yours and different to the person they're sitting next to. And all of that needs to come in when we start thinking about assessment. And I know that that's quite a kind of difficult thing sometimes, but if we go down the line of we only assess what we see in front of us in that box right now, and we're going to ignore the fact that they came to the samba band, they were in the school musical and they were singing in 3-part harmony and all of those things, when we start giving grades out, that's an important thing, that we actually recognise their whole musician. And then therefore thinking about this, where can they go? That's what we constitute to mean the formative assessment. If you take away the word assessment, the formative developmental stuff, if you like. I know Black and William actually talked about how problematic it was that they put the word assessment in, I think, Martin, when they talked about formative assessment, didn't they?
Yes, and said they rather wish they hadn't called it formative assessment.
Yeah, so really thinking of formative development. What can I do to make their music better? And think of blue sky thinking, really. If you didn't have to do musical assessments, what would you do? What would your music curriculum look like? How would your teaching change for that? How would the structure of your classroom change? Because when we just assess things on the last lesson of a unit, actually we often miss the things that are in the gaps and the things that happened in the processes along the way. And that always seems like such a shame. So we're rattling towards the end. If you can just put this up for us. We're going to take some questions in a minute, but we wanted to really finish off by talking about, you know, what we think is important here. And I think really we're saying that it's about it being musical. It's about it being a joyful thing that you have in your classroom. We talk about this at the beginning of the booklet, and we talk about it again at the end. But, you know, music isn't something that just happens in the classroom. We have this whole musical culture which goes in through our schools. We have people coming in to do music. We have children going out to do music. There's things going on in communities. And so actually, where schools are really strong in music, it's not just something that happens for 45 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon every other week on their timetable, but it is a practical and academic subject that involves them thinking and acting musically within the classroom and hopefully beyond the classroom to kind of follow up their own aspirations in music as well.
Well, I think it's really important that we emphasise that the first sentence here, music is both a practical and academic subject, and that's the entire point of what it is that we've been talking about. I think if we'll finish on the next slide, I think, if that's okay. So let's make this the last slide, and it's just a reminder of where the materials are, and this has already been put into the chat as well, but just in case you need another go, that's where it is. I think if we finish on that slide, and then is it Ella or Courtney are going to feed us with some questions, if that's okay?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Ali, as well, for both of you for that brilliant presentation. That was really useful. And yes, we have now got some time for a Q&A. So we've had some pre-submitted questions, but also if anyone has any live ones, please do pop those into the Q&A as well. So our first question is, My SLT are directing per fortnight for year 7, 1 written theory lesson and 1 practical. Are there any benefits linked to this framework?
Do you want to start, Ali, or shall I?
I think what I go back to is asking your SLT why they've come up with the idea and why they think this is appropriate. Because teaching music musically, certainly from a lot of the research and how young people perceive music is about actually doing music, and through doing music you learn about music. So being immersed in the music actually leads to the musical learning. So I would go back to them and question what it is that says I need a theory lesson, if you like, or a written lesson followed by a practical lesson. There's actually some things also written by Ofsted over many years now, talking about how this is not a literacy lesson, in case, because obviously we don't know the context, maybe this is linked to children being able to read and write better. Don't really know from the question, but actually they talk about how important it is that music is musical, and the reading and writing, if appropriate, and there's not much of that, too much of that really at Key Stage 3, is there to support the musical learning.
I'd also
Thank you.
I'd say as well, talk to your local music hub. One of the things that Ofsted said a few years ago was music hubs should be in a position to have difficult conversations with SLT. And I think this is a point where you can invoke your local music hub and say, look, this has happened. I need some help with what's going on. And please, music hub, come and have a difficult conversation with my SLT, because exactly as Ali said, if you trawl back through many of the Ofsted reports, this isn't something that Ofsted are going to look favourably on. And generally, if you go into an SLT and say Ofsted won't like this, then they will pay some attention. So I think one of the things I'd suggest is local music hub, and then do a bit of Ofsted digging as well.
I think the third thing I would suggest is look at what they do in PE. Do they have one theory lesson and one practical lesson, or are they outside doing lots of things? So look at other practical subjects like art and like PE, and think about what they're doing, and find people that you can kind of go to help support you along the way.
Thank you, that's great. Just a quick one. Rachel has asked Martin if you are able to repeat the great sentence you said about assessing in the domain, because she didn't get to write it down in time. If you can remember.
I have no idea what I said or what sentence it was, but
we can see it in the recording.
I was going to say yes, but there is a recording, so hopefully then she can listen to this back and see what I said. I have no idea what I said. Sorry.
Thank you. So the next one we've got is, are big ideas central to planning and engaging Key Stage 3 music curriculum?
Did you?
Big ideas, was that?
Are big ideas?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they probably are, because they make you take a bird's eye view, and they take it. They're conceptual in some ways, and they're kind of philosophical in some ways, and they're practical in some ways, and so they kind of make you kind of take your lens out and then think about, what do I do? Why am I doing it? Is it the right thing? So it's a kind of reflective tool as much as anything else. So yes, to me, I would say big ideas are quite important to that. We didn't really go through all of the big ideas today, because obviously we don't really have the time for that in the short amount of time that we have. But the sections of them are around values, which we did spend a bit of time on. The purposes of the music in your school, and that's not just music in your classroom, but music beyond that, and who gets involved in music. We talk a lot about inclusion and wanting everybody to be involved, and yet I'm sure in a lot of schools, and I know this is the case in schools I've taught at in the past too, if you looked at the young people who actually engaged in anything beyond the classroom, it's a certain type of student, and it's certain students that go for certain things. So we're thinking about our whole music offer over that, and how do we make that more appealing, more inclusive, more accessible. The next section is on the ownership of the curriculum, pedagogies and assessment. And I would suggest that in a lot of schools, the music teachers are actually the owners of the curriculum, and to a certain extent the pedagogies, and probably to a lesser extent the assessment. But it gives you opportunities to kind of go through and ask yourself and your team about those things, and just to sit down and have a conversation with people. And also, like the previous question, was about convincing other people potentially about the advantages of something. If you've thought about all of these things from lots of different perspectives, you've got many more arguments to go forward with about why you want to do things in a certain way. So you're coming from a position of having thought about it rather than just kind of on the spot thinking. That's a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think they're really useful. At least I hope they are. But it is free, and if you don't like them, don't use them.
Great, thank you. So another one we've just had through, someone has asked, our school asks us to do a silent do now activity at the start of every lesson, which is recall based. What is your opinion on SLT insisting on silent activities in a music lesson?
Want to go first, Martin?
Yes, the trouble with music is it generally isn't silent, is it? I don't know how many lessons this person gets, but I suspect it's not many per week. Therefore, by asking them to do a silent activity at the start, they're taking a considerable percentage of the amount of time in a lesson to do something which could be antithetical to music. Now, this isn't mean to say that it is impossible to do, because I have heard a number of things. I have met a number of instances where this is not the case. Now, one of the questions that I always have about this is, how do you define silent? Is it absolute, you can hear a pin drop from 200 yards silence? Or what would happen if the pupils are silent, but you're playing a recording of something? Is that still silent? In which case, one teacher I know had to do something like this, and they got round it by playing a recording of what the kids did in the previous lesson. No talking, but there was sound. So I think that these whole school diktats need a bit of unpicking sometimes, particularly when they can be problematic towards the very nature of the subject itself. So I think there's an awful lot of things that really need to be unpicked in this. And what's SLT thinking? And is it a sort of knee-jerk reaction and they haven't thought it through? And again, as Ali said earlier, it's time to talk to, do PE do a silent activity at the start of the session? Do they kick balls in silence? And so there's things about, what's going on and why are they doing it? And I'd really want to get to the bottom of why is this being done, and have SLT really thought it through.
You talked at the beginning of that question, I think it asked something about recall, Ella. And so perhaps SLT's thinking was that the beginning of the lesson, we need to recall something. Well, actually listening to a piece of music, I actually wrote down the same thing as Martin. I put recording of, and I put them and underlined it, because actually that recalls and takes you back to where you were. If it's about recalling something, look, a lot of learning builds on what came before. So the first thing we try to do is consolidate that. It might be just reminding them of the song or their piece or the chords or whatever. So actually, if you could split away the silent part of it, you can take the idea of recall as being something that's actually quite useful potentially to the start of a lesson. Could be something recalling from something completely different. It could be recalling the sound of something. It could be recalling all sorts of things, but it doesn't. When I've seen it happen, it tends to be that kind of declarative pub quiz knowledge kinds of ideas, which kind of, for me, misses the point of that. So I would say focus on the word recall. See if you can find ways that either don't have to be silent, or I think Christopher Stevens, actually, the Ofsted Inspector for Music of the moment, he did talk about something about this in one of the things I went along to. I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think with that he was talking about how if you went straight into musicking and you were singing something or you were playing something, then you are recalling what you were doing. So the idea of silence doesn't come up in that.
Right, thank you. So next, I teach a module on music production using BandLab and GarageBand. My assessment involves cooperative music making in groups and building a completed track. Due to the nature of group work, half of these projects are unfinished and are difficult to assess. Do you have any recommendations?
again,
I think it sounds great, what you're doing. It's great to hear the technology being in there, and it's perfectly normal actually for Key Stage 3 for a lot of things to be done in groups. Martin, you talk.
No, I was going to say this sounds to me like one of those questions about the construction of the curriculum. Like, we have to finish on June the 15th or whatever. And so my question would be, why do you have to finish if they haven't finished? Can you go on for a bit longer? What happens if you don't finish on whatever date I just said? Are you able to extend it? The other thing I would say is there a way that you can create a task in which the process is just as important, and be thinking about the learning? So I think I'd like kids to do and learn, but as well as that, I don't want to sort of artificially close it down. But I can understand that in some schools the answer is yes, it has to finish, because at that point the other half of the year need to use the tech, and we're off to, like that earlier person said, we're off to now do written work for the next 6 weeks. So there can be contingent reasons, but there are ways. Again, I'd want to interrogate this a bit more, but as Ali said, this sounds really good to me, that actually this is practical music making, this is musicking in action. And another way that perhaps it can be dealt with is, can you move it earlier in the year so that things can be revisited later? You know, there are so much in many of these questions that needs unpicking.
Yeah, I think if you thought about what's the purpose of the learning that you're trying to get, maybe you could have 4 units in your year instead of 6. I think is, think about spreading things out. Think about what scaffolds you could put in place to kind of support or speed up certain groups, if that might be what's required. But the danger of that is that this sounds like a beautifully free, open idea to me. And actually, that's really important that whatever we do, we keep the ownership of it with the young people who are creating it, so that when they engage in the process and get to the end, they felt that it's theirs and they felt that it's worthwhile. So it kind of is quite potentially unsatisfying for young people not to get to the end, because we think a lot in education, the process is really important, and it is really important because that's where a lot of the learning happens. But if you get to the end of the term and you haven't got something you can share, that can be really demoralizing, actually. So thinking about all of those things, there's a bigger question in there too about how do you assess the contribution of the people who are part of the team that are creating it too. But that's another big can of worms to open today.
Thank you. I think we've got time to squash in one final question. So I have a student in the classroom who is a very talented instrumentalist but refuses to partake in singing group work. Consequently, it's difficult to assess them on this category when the rest of the class are there. Should I change the assessment for one student or keep trying to get them to sing?
I think, again, I want to know more. Was the phrase talented instrumentalist or something that you just said? So what is going on that makes this person reluctant to sing if they are a talented instrumentalist of some sort? So is there more that we need to know in order to find out a bit more about what's going on? And then, assuming that there is, then, okay, we can only deal with the question that we're asked. The other thing I would say is, I would hope that assessment can take into account the broad range of achievements that a young person has. So if they are a talented instrumentalist, then how does that count in terms of what they are doing? And how does that feed into whatever assessment schedule it is that the teachers devised, so that can be done? So I think there's more that we need to know in order to discover a little bit about what's going on. But there's an awful lot of things that can be done. I think I appreciate that we're about to run out of time, but what worries me at times is when we get this idea of an assessment lesson, and it's only things which are done in the assessment lesson which count. And if you don't do it in the assessment lesson, you might as well not have done it at all. So if that's what they're saying about this talented instrumentalist, that in the assessment lesson they basically don't join in, therefore they get a naught, that doesn't strike me as representative of that young person's achievements overall. And so there are things that I think again need to know a bit more to be able to answer in a helpful way.
I think it exemplifies too the danger of then having got your grids and then having to somehow turn them into numbers for SLT to look at and go, oh, it's gone orange, now I'm going to send it back, see if we can get something else, because maths and English say it's supposed to be better than it is. I guess my question is the singing important to the learning in this context? Again, we don't particularly know. What is it that we're trying to get them to musically be able to do? And are there other ways in which that young person, you know, there are 30 often individuals in a class, and yeah, so thinking about what it is musically we want them to do. A bit like Martin was saying earlier about the oboe, if the voice is not your thing, maybe musically you can enact it in another way on something else, but it does very much depend on what it is that you want. I think sometimes though it comes down to identity with singing, a lot of the time actually in Key Stage 3, and you know, changing voices, all those kinds of things, choosing the right repertoire, setting the singing up in the right way, finding ways to even just, you know, then it comes back to the pedagogy. How do we go about it? How do we support voices in a classroom so that young people don't feel exposed when they sing and those kind of things? So there's a lot in there, but hopefully that gives the person who asked the question a few things to think about.
Thank you so much. I think we're pretty much out of time. So thank you, Ali and Martin, for that extremely useful session. And thank you to everyone for joining us. If you have any more questions, please do email us at inquiries@ismtrust.org. And we'll also be sending you the webinar recording as well as a feedback survey, which would be great if you could fill out. Our next webinar will be on the 16th of July on working as a musician in the age of AI. So finally, Al, thank you again for watching, and we hope to see you at another ISM event soon. Goodbye.